My name is Rick Feldman. On behalf of the Northwest Bronx Racial Justice Book Group, I'd like to welcome our members and guests to a special presentation from the Montgomery Four entitled Learning from Memorials to Slavery, Lynching, and the Holocaust. This evening honors the third anniversary of the opening of the Memorial to Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. Our presenters all attended the opening of the memorial 3 years ago this week. In doing so, they performed a sacred task. They bore witness for those who cannot speak of a brutal and horrific truth, the hanging of thousands of Black Americans. Their talk tonight will draw a link between the vision of the Equal Justice Initiative founder, Bryan Stevenson, for the Memorial to Peace and Justice in Montgomery and the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. Both are grave reminders of where hate can lead. This link can also be found in an expression that has been taking root in America today regarding undoing the past. In Germany, the word long used for this idea, which encompasses their efforts to change their national culture after the Holocaust, is Vergangenheit Verarbeitung, which translated into English means working off the past. These words, when proactively applied, can lead us to change and hope for the future. Moreover, as each of the presenters has traveled to Montgomery to pay respects for this uniquely American tragedy, we hope this evening's conversation will be a catalyst to motivate a post-COVID trip to Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma for members of our community. I put my email in the chat. If you're interested, please contact me. Additionally, our book group has been meeting for close to 2 years. We have read and continue to read books that challenge us to acknowledge and confront bias and prejudice in ourselves and to speak and act against discrimination that's fueled by bigotry and hate whenever and wherever we experience it. Our current reading, Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, will be discussed on Thursday, May 6th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. If you'd like the Zoom link, then contact us. I also put the contact in the chat. We welcome people from all backgrounds. Finally, I would like to thank my co-facilitators of the Northwest Bronx Racial Justice Book Group for their support in preparing for this evening's program. Joan Johnson Lewis, leader of the Riverdale Yonkers Society for Ethical Culture, and Jennifer Scarlett, coordinator of the North Bronx Racial Justice and Bronx Climate Justice North. And also, especially, I would like to thank our presenters. Now, Joan Johnson Lewis will review the procedures of this evening and introduce our program. Thank you all for joining us.
So I'm really glad to be part of this tonight. I want to give you some technical notes. We're going to do the best that we can technically. We're human, not perfect. We are recording this session. A copy of the recording will be available within a week. We hope sooner than the end of the week. And it will be on the Ethical Society's YouTube channel. At the end of the presentation, there will be time, we hope, for some questions. Please hold your questions until then. If most of the people who registered show up, we will prompt you later to put your questions in the chat because we aren't going to see them if you put them in the chat before that. You will be muted during the presentation so we don't have distracting sounds from the various settings we're in. If we do have any disruptions, just hang in there. We will handle it as quickly as possible. Before the question period, I would invite you to change your name using the rename function. You can mouse your arrow over your own window and click on the dots and rename yourself so that we know how to refer to you if you ask a question. Okay, so that's, I think, all that I need to say technically. And I will turn it over to our four speakers.
Good evening. I am Robert Dottin, and the four of us call ourselves the Montgomery Four, in jest, for reasons that will become obvious later. Left to right in the picture are Linda Rousseau, Adine Usher, Tosia McCormick, and me. I am an
Yes, hello. I'm an active member at All Souls Unitarian Church, and I'm Linda Rousseau, I'm sorry. And I've been involved with social justice programs for over 10 years there. I also focus on ending mass incarceration, solitary confinement, and work to empower the families to strategically support their loved ones who are incarcerated. 7 years ago, I learned that my ancestors on my father's side owned slaves for over 150 years in Santo Domingo, capital of what today is the Dominican Republic. During the slave rebellion in 1791, my ancestor, Jean-Baptiste Clement Rousseau, escaped to Philadelphia, where he became a doctor.
Good evening. My name is Adine Usher. I'm an educational consultant and advocate for students with physical disabilities. Social action and racial justice have been a part of my life since childhood, when dinner table conversations centered around racial inequities. At Oberlin, I led the campus NAACP chapter that raised bail money for the student lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. And for the last 40 years, I've worked with the racial justice team at the White Plains Unitarian Universalist congregation. Following an old Quaker saying, my happiness lies at the intersection of my passions and the needs of others.
Good evening. My name is Tosia McCormick, and despite my very Irish last name, I was born in Germany to Jewish Holocaust surviving parents and promptly classified as a stateless alien. America embraced me as a first-generation immigrant, and I will be forever grateful. My family's and my own experiences have led me to work with what Dostoevsky would call the insulted and the injured. HIV patients, drug users, incarcerated young men, victims of abuse and poverty. I'm a therapist and an educator, and my life philosophy has always been the Jewish dictum of tikkun olam, to heal the world.
And I, Robert Dottin, am a professor of biology, and more specifically genetics, which drives discoveries in medicine, including COVID, and reveals the mysteries of human migration and ancestry. I have Afro-Caribbean genes from Trinidad, where Columbus actually landed in 1498, and his legacy remains controversial. I am also a Unitarian from All Souls in New York City, a history maker, and I consider myself an activist. We're honored to be hosted today, and we sincerely hope that you find meaning in our presentation. We shall provide opportunities for questions and discussion. We realize that people hold strong opinions on the issues of monuments and memorials. However, we need to describe the varied responses and reactions to these symbols. We encourage questions and comments at the end. This is the Robert E. Lee Monument on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. Some monuments are undergoing radical transformations from objects of adulation to structures of derision and ridicule. Others are being removed and new monuments are emerging. What can we learn from them? How can we harness their transformative potential,
the death of monuments. The furor over the death of George Floyd has reignited demands to remove dozens of statues and monuments around the country and around the world. They include past presidents such as George Washington, conquistadors such as Christopher Columbus, Confederate generals, defenders of segregation, and others whose racial and political views or conduct are now widely reviled. Any statue is a repository of memory and a bid for immortality. So what's really at issue here is not the statues per se, but the point of view that they may represent. In our presentation today, we attempt to discuss what makes monuments so important to the psyche and ideology of a country and its population. How can pieces of stone become such powerful lightning rods for change, and who should make those changes?
Why are monuments so important? Monuments deify leaders. Obelisks were called sky piercers by Egyptians in 2600 BCE. They represented living deity. The Washington Monument was similarly awe-inspiring. However, since the advent of the recent Black Lives Matter protests, I look upon this monument with less reverence and more skepticism. Washington was considered a great leader, and he was the father of our country. However, an issue not discussed in many history books is the fact that he bought, sold, and exploited enslaved people. This reality taints his legacy.
Why are monuments so important? They glorify wars and conquest, warriors and ideologies. Robert E. Lee graduated from West Point as a skilled tactician. He fought in the Mexican-American War and put down John Brown's slave insurrection at Harper's Ferry. Lee was reputed to be a brutal slave owner who never spared the whip. The statue was erected 25 years after the Civil War ended in 1865 and was recently removed from Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia.
Why are monuments so important? They justify and perpetuate domination of conquered peoples. They attempt to stop time and freeze progress. In 1984, Trinidad and Tobago pioneered the end of Discovery Day that celebrated Columbus's discovery. A decade later, most countries abolished Discovery Day. The first Columbus monument in Trinidad was erected by enslaver Hippolyte Bourdais in 1881. But many people, including his granddaughter, are now petitioning the mayor of Port of Spain, the capital city, to remove it. Citizens of Tarrytown and Mount Kisco in Westchester are also petitioning to remove statues of Columbus from their villages. I have seen 1,400 signatures on change.org.
Why are monuments so important? They reinforce the dominance of some, but intimidate others. This 176-year-old stone slave auction block was removed from a street corner in Fredericksburg, Virginia on June 5th, 2020. The removal was initially delayed by persistent lawsuits and the coronavirus. Many Blacks refused to walk past the auction block. Particularly troubling was the fact that tourists would pay Black boys to pose on the block for photos. For Blacks, it's been a source of pain and suffering. After George Floyd's death, crowds chanted, "Remove the stone," and sprayed it with graffiti. A landmark memorial will soon stand on the corner to honor those people who were bought and sold.
Why are monuments so important? They celebrate apparent major medical and scientific successes. Dr. J. Marion Sims, born in 1813, until recently was celebrated for his gynecological successes. He developed instruments and techniques for removing fistulas in women. However, the techniques were done by experimenting on enslaved women without anesthesia, even when anesthesia was available, a form of torture. After major protests initiated by Black women, in 2018, his statue was finally removed from Central Park in New York City to a cemetery. It will be replaced by the work of Vinnie Bagwell, an African-American sculptor from Yonkers, New York. She's currently working on the enslaved Africans' rain garden in Yonkers and a similarly themed structure in Irvington, New York. Why are monuments so important? They initially maintain attitudes of innate superiority, which can over time be dislodged. The slide shows a statue of Edward Colson in Bristol, UK. His company branded the letters RAC, Royal African Company, on the chests of 100,000 enslaved people. Bunce Island in Sierra Leone was a famous transshipment point before undertaking the Middle Passage. Greedy African mercenaries also participated in these atrocities. 20,000 of Colston's victims died and were thrown overboard in the Atlantic crossing.
Why do we build memorials? To honor the dead and to help in healing. This memorial in Belgium celebrates the heroism of 11 African-American soldiers in a racially segregated field artillery unit in World War II. They were captured during the Battle of the Bulge and massacred by the German army. 1.2 million African-Americans served valiantly in the segregated armed services in World War II, while simultaneously being denied their civil rights in their own country.
How do some structures become memorials? Statues of enslaved children in the Whitney Plantation Museum are sculpted without eyes, as if to protect those children from seeing the horrors of plantation life. How do some structures become memorials? Memorials can evoke empathy for the suffering of others. Instead of using his plantation to perpetuate antebellum myths to tourists, iconoclast John Cummings turned it into America's first slavery museum. The Whitney Plantation in Louisiana is a rare plantation museum that shows accurately the tortured lives of enslaved people. Plantations were, in my opinion, nothing more than slave labor camps. Not all memorials are carved in stone. My body is a Confederate monument. Caroline Randall Williams wrote this article in the New York Times. She said, "I have rape-colored skin. My light brown blackness is a living testament to the rules, the practices, the causes of the Old South. If there are those who want to remember the legacy of the Confederacy, If they want monuments, well, then my body is a monument. My skin is a monument. DNA testing has allowed me to confirm I am the descendant of Black women who were domestic servants and white men who raped their help. Most of us with light brown Blackness have ancestors who were raped.
Not all memorials are carved in stone. Dead bodies and their DNA are living memorials. By the 18th century, more than 12 million Africans were kidnapped and shipped to the Americas. 2 million died at sea. DNA testing by 23andMe showed that many enslaved people in North America came from Nigeria through the British Caribbean, including Trinidad and, yes, Jamaica. Although 60% of those Africans were male, contemporary African DNA contained only 40% of DNA from African males. Why? According to 23andMe, the discrepancy is due to excessive deaths in the male population and rape of the enslaved women by European men who contributed to the gene pool. Like Carolyn Randall Williams, their bodies and their DNA are living memorials.
Memorials force us to confront and face cruelty and injustice. This is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. It is the brainchild of MacArthur Genius awardee and civil rights attorney, Bryan Stevenson. It uncovers the truth in our past, highlighting events and individuals that we must remember. The National Memorial and the Legacy Museum are the two major memorials in Montgomery. They describe the African-American tragedy, but they also warn this and future generations to face the truth about history and to take informed action towards reconciliation. Attending the opening of this memorial in April 2018 is what brought us together, the Montgomery Four.
This is a depiction of the arrival of enslaved people in the New World. Kwame Akoto-Bomfo of Ghana created these haunting sculptures that greet visitors at the entrance to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. They depict the way Africans arrived in the New World, in chains. Akoto-Bomfo says, "My piece is on slavery. It's the path that leads to lynching. African Americans in particular should understand that we also know their pain. We empathize." Ironically, Akoto-Bomfo was denied a visa to the US in 2017 and therefore prevented from overseeing the installation of his work. As a slave, he would have been welcome. As a free man, not so much. The wall in the background provides an exhaustive history of the African-American experience.
Steles of steel. At the Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, the brown steel pillars, or steles, show the names of counties and the names of victims, or simply the designation anonymous. The design was inspired by the Holocaust memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, which you will soon see. As you proceed through the memorial, the floor gently slopes down, causing the steles to appear to rise, giving them the appearance of hanging bodies. They represent over 4,000 documented victims lynched after Reconstruction between 1877 and 1950. Here I am talking with a visitor and activist from Ocoee County near Orlando, Florida, where lynching occurred. members of her Unitarian congregation have been documenting lynching in Ocoee.
The promise of this memorial. Audience, even while you're muted, please read these words together and aloud with me. For the hanged and beaten, for the shot, drowned, and burned, for the tortured, tormented, and terrorized, for those abandoned by the rule of law, we will remember. This is the Legacy Museum from enslavement to mass incarceration. The Legacy Museum is located steps from one of the most active slave auction sites in America. The outside of the Legacy Museum highlights in its windows events from slavery to Jim Crow on the top left, all the way to mass incarceration bottom right, from the past to the present. The building itself was once used as a holding pen for enslaved people before they were taken across the street to be auctioned off.
This is the Holocaust Memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. Memorials are repositories of memory that raise complex questions about which history we choose to remember, or whose story we choose to ignore or forget. When we say the Holocaust, we usually refer to the slaughter of 6 million European Jews by the Nazis. Of course, other groups were targeted by the regime as well: Roma, disabled people, communists, homosexuals, resistors, and German people of mixed race from Germany's exploits in Africa. In addition, as we speak, there are genocides taking place in other parts of the world. However, the systematic, coldly bureaucratic, planned genocide of a whole people stands out amid the slaughter. Lest we're tempted to believe that this is old history and all in the past, on January 6, 2021, some members of the Proud Boys, a white nationalist group among the many that stormed the Capitol, waving Confederate flags, sported prominently on their shirts above Nazi eagle insignia the message 6MWE. 6MWE stands for 6 million was not enough. This may answer the question, why do we need memorials? Writing of memorials in Germany, Ian Buruma, former editor of the New York Review of Books, distinguishes between a Denkmal, a monument built to glorify a leader, an event, or the nation as a whole, and a Mahnmal, a monument of warning. Holocaust memorials, he says, are monuments of warning. So how do artists sound these warnings? Should such memorials be literal or abstract? How can the form be the message? Both the Holocaust Memorial and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice convey strong messages through their steles or slabs. The Holocaust Memorial's 2,711 concrete slabs clearly influenced the design that the National Memorial adopted. They both provide physical and psychological spaces for reflection and mourning. However, the differences in design also reflect their unique messages. The steles or slabs of the Holocaust Memorial vary in height from 8 inches to 15 feet and cover a vast area, 4.5 acres. The architects designed the slabs to produce an uneasy, confusing atmosphere, and they say that the whole sculpture aims to represent a seemingly ordered system that has lost touch with any human reason. Wandering through the massive slabs, a visitor feels disoriented, oppressed, and increasingly closed in. There are no names on the slabs. Many victims were only known by the numbers tattooed on their arms, and there is no escape. Of the millions represented here, only a few survived, my family among them. My mother and father and their 4 small children escaped from the ghetto in Krakow, and through truly heroic efforts, never actually expecting to survive, saved themselves and their children. We are here as survivors to recognize evil, past and present, to educate and collaborate, and heed the warnings of these memorials so the horrors they depict can never happen again. That is why we are here.
Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. Susan Neiman is an Atlanta-born moral philosopher and writer of Jewish heritage, whose journey took her from Harvard to Yale to Tel Aviv University, and finally to Brandenburg Academy in Berlin, where she has lived for over 20 years. In this book, she explores Germany's initial denial of its complicity in Nazi atrocities. Eventually, aided in part by attitudes of their young folks, Germany finally accepted responsibility and condemned its Nazi past. Neiman contrasts that evolution with the inability of the United States to confront slavery and its racist consequences.
How did Germany confront its racist past? It removed public displays of its Nazi past.
It educated the population through readings, lectures, drama, and music.
It displayed signs, plaques, and memorials nationwide to honor the victims of Nazi atrocities. It rewrote school textbooks to expose Nazi atrocities. Imagine an America where the raw and brutal truth of slavery and racial terror were integrated into historical narratives of American exceptionalism. Those are words from Susan Neiman.
What can we do? We can read books. Read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, a book in high demand. Read Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Read Isabel Wilkerson's Caste. Read Susan Neiman's Learning from the Germans, which describes how, as the Germans did, America can address its racist history. Join or start a book club. Rick Feldman helps to run an excellent book club in Riverdale, where members grapple with issues of racism. Support sculpting projects like Vinnie Bagwell's Enslaved African Rain Garden in Yonkers, New York, or her work in Irvington, New York.
What can we do locally? Change starts at home. Document lynching in your area as a group and earn a stele from the Equal Justice Initiative for public display and education.
Support organizations like Papillon2030.org that promotes self-help through covenants. Support efforts to document slavery and to educate your village, as Kathy Sears, Sarah Cox, and Vinnie Bagwell are doing in my village, Irvington, New York.
What else can we do? Build memorials and road markers that honor enslaved people.
Transform existing monuments. Here is what National Public Radio calls a joyful transformation of Robert E. Lee's pedestal in Virginia. Join historical societies to educate your communities.
Work to eradicate systemic racism in your schools, health systems, housing, and in your businesses.
Use your voting power to affect change.
Here's Brian Stevenson, one of the most powerful voices of justice in the world, and the inspiring leader of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. He advocates confronting the truth about atrocities such as slavery as the first step toward reconciliation. Next, he advocates that we, the people, can all work for justice at a local level. Even though we are muted, let us read Stevenson's words together. I don't think slavery ended in 1865. It just evolved. If you love your community, then you need to be insisting on justice in all circumstances. Thank you all. We welcome your questions or comments.
Okay, so what we're going to do for questions is we have a fair number of people here. So I'm going to open chat so that you can type into chat publicly and make sure that you're writing to everyone. Right after where it says to, you should have a choice to write to everyone. And if you have a question for our panelists today, please type it there. We'll give you a minute to be typing.
Can we hear them?
And Rick, did you have one to start out with that you wanted to begin with?
Well, I could try one, but so it's a little, there's a lot of different nuances in the conversation about memorials. And I recently heard that, there's been a big movement to change the name of the Edmund Petty Bridge in Selma to the John Lewis Bridge. But I've heard that some of the local people in Selma are not in favor of that change. So I'm just curious about how do we, how do we think about changing names, and who really is responsible for making these decisions?
Rick, I'd like to weigh in on that. I think these decisions have to be made locally. I can certainly understand why African Americans who live in that area of Alabama want to keep the name of the Petty Bridge named after the head of the Ku Klux Klan. They don't want the evil erased. They want it acknowledged. So that, I understand that clearly.
Okay, a question from chat from Tom and Pat. Do you know of any work being done in the Maryland area, and what is being done in the DC area?
Ooh.
I don't know. I heard today that people were documenting lynching sites in Maryland, but I don't know more specifically what's being done in other areas.
It's possible that if you contact the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, they would have an idea of where people are doing this work to document.
There are also two, I know of two Unitarian congregations in Baltimore. And it's possible that they would also be involved in some activists activities like that.
Yeah.
One is in Delaney Valley, and one is downtown in Baltimore.
And Shira Gordon writes that she believes there is historical information being shared about Van Cortlandt Park in our own Bronx area. Van Cortlandt Park originally was a plantation. Does anyone know more about that?
No, what we are learning is there was much more slavery in this area of the country than any of us were originally led to believe.
Yeah, I would add that there's been work recently done there. There's been found what appears to be an African-American cemetery on the grounds. And there's research just before the pandemic hit. I know there was active research going on to figure out what was there.
You know, I recently went to the Museum of Natural History with my grandson. And, you know, the statue out front of Teddy Roosevelt with a Native American man on one side and an African man on the other side has been really under attack in terms of showing this, again, both in the positions of those statues and his elevated state over those two, that this is a statue that really has to go. Now, instead of removing the statue, and there was a lot of talking about it, the museum has now done an entire wall of arguments for and against, people talking about the history and what's being depicted and so forth. So that's one way of approaching it, I suppose, because the statue itself is actually a beautiful work of art. They are now doing the educating about the statue in the museum.
It also,
Okay, and go ahead.
it also needs to be noted that in Westchester, in small Westchester towns, many of the street names are named after the leading citizens of a century ago, most of them slave owners.
That's certainly the case in Irvington, where I live. And but in Irvington, there's a lot of discussion about what to do to recognize those events. And certainly Vinnie Bagwell will be constructing a statue near a site where enslaved people are buried. And also one on the main street of Irvington, near to in the business area. So these are attempts to educate the population and to engage the children. One of the statues will be very close to the middle school. And so those are the kinds of efforts, I think, that can be quite informative and perhaps even transformative. I believe in other villages, well, I spoke, for instance, about the fact that there's a rain garden, which she's constructing in Yonkers. That's under progress. And many of the statues have been completed and are now in the library. And eventually, when the rain garden is completed, those statues will be installed in the rain garden on the banks of the Hudson River. So those kinds of efforts, I think, can be very powerful. They can engage a large number of people in the community, and also they'll remain for a long time and to help to educate the next generation. So we won't have this kind of distorted history, you know, of a white man on a horse dominating most of the installations throughout the country.
And Jennifer points out that in Riverdale, right here, there is an enormous statue of Henry Hudson, and in relief at the foot of the statue are depicted Native Americans kneeling before Hudson and other white people and offering gifts. So some of the statues are very close to home.
Irrepressible egos.
I think one of the things we're hoping to do with talking about this is to get people to pay attention close to home, you know, because if we're living with statues and monuments and all that close to home, we tend to not even notice them. We just walk past them on our way to wherever we're going. I think it's good practice to actually start looking at what's out there, you know, in your neighborhood, in your area, and so forth, and just notice what's there.
Well, Tosia, I think that was one of the tasks that Brian Stevenson gave us at the conclusion of the opening in Montgomery 3 years ago. He said, we want you to take this information home to your local communities and start the education there.
I mean, this may seem very obvious, but in Manhattan, you have the Columbus Circle. The statue of Columbus is still there. There's a statue of Columbus in Central Park, and there's always a guard by the statue in the park, and you can't get near the Columbus Circle statue itself. It's protected. But I've never heard anything discussed about doing anything about it. Has anyone heard anything?
I think there are discussions going on. I know a friend of mine in Washington, D.C. just told me that while people were waiting for the verdict of the trial, the statue of Christopher Columbus in Washington, D.C. was being written on and defaced. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that so far as the statue of Columbus at Columbus Circle in New York City is concerned, there's been a great deal of activism, in part by the indigenous community, the local indigenous community, in trying to persuade the city to dismantle that statue. I think if you just do an internet search for that statue, it was one of the statues considered by, I think de Blasio put together a commission to study, you know, the suitability of various memorials and statues around the city, and the commission decided to leave that statue in place. But there are continual protests about and at that statue.
Well, as you know, in Germany, Gunther Demning has constructed a large number of these stepping stones to commemorate people who suffered in the hands of, especially Jewish people, who suffered in the hands of the Nazis. And these are small bricks that have been constructed in the streets near where these abuses took place. And there are 70,000 of them in Europe right now. Little bronze plaques in the concrete, in the pathway of people who would be walking, to bring to their attention the fact that some atrocities took place in their neighborhood. And that,
also in front of the houses where those people were taken from.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a deliberate effort to keep people reminded of what's happened, and to clarify rather than to obfuscate these kinds of events of evil, so that it never happens again. And one of the lessons that we're trying to promulgate is that America should really adapt those particular attitudes as well, instead of hiding behind ridiculous stories about these men on horses and what they did and how they, and calling things like the Indian removal instead of calling it genocide.
Okay, some other comments we have from Lane Cobb about a specific area in Baltimore. The Canton area of Baltimore City is, I believe you're saying it's being studied. And he has a link to an article about the petition regarding a statue there. Rick Feldman points out that there is a local historical society, Kingsbridge Historical Society, and he has some links there. And Jennifer has some information about an organization called Decolonize This Place, where you can find more information. So Jennifer also asks, would you speak to efforts like the national campaign to demand that localities rename Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day?
Well, personally, I think it would be brilliant.
Of course.
I do too. It's not just in America that the change is taking place. That's a universal change that I think most countries welcome. It's a more accurate kind of.
I just saw a posting by a mother of a question her 8-year-old son, I think, was asked in history class, and it was something like, where did indigenous people in this country used to live? And his answer was, we still live here. And which is brilliant, right? But it kind of addresses the erasure, of that whole history. And
All our great national parks, that's all land that was owned and lived on by indigenous people.
So I would also add to the kinds of monuments and memorials you've been talking about. When I went to Europe on one trip, which is now a long time ago, one of the things that struck me was in Denmark and Norway, part of their memorializing is that they have resistance museums.
Yes.
To try to remember people who stand up to forces of evil.
Yes. They have not only resistance museums, but even when you walk around Paris, you will see plaques on the walls of buildings saying that this resistance person lived here or was killed here or was captured here by the Nazis. So you find those plaques in different neighborhoods in Paris.
well, I think this raises another interesting question, which is, yes, you can put down a plaque, but we also know that there is huge national denial in Europe, in almost every single country, of their collaboration with the Nazis during the war. So, statues are nice and plaques are nice, but until people are able to really take responsibility for that history and their own collaboration in that history, plaques are not enough.
You're right.
Yeah. Didn't Poland just pass a law in the last 2 years making it illegal to say that Poland was complicit in the Holocaust?
Yes.
They're going in the other direction.
Well, that's like Turkey and the Armenians. They just pretend it didn't happen.
Okay, so we have a question from Tom and Pat. One of the things I appreciate so much is the bringing together of the two different historical abuse of minorities, African and Jewish. Where else is this happening together rather than two different areas of work?
Tough question. I don't know the answer to it, I must admit.
Actually,
I hope it's happening in many places.
yeah, I know here in Westchester that a number of synagogues are working in collaboration with a predominantly Black congregations. They're exchanging speakers and in some cases exchanging programs. So I'm particularly with the Reform synagogues. There are more conversations than you would expect between their congregations and predominantly Black churches.
And I mean, there is documented history of Jews being very actively involved in the civil rights movement.
Well, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, for those of us of a certain age who grew up in the North, Jews were the only white allies we had, simply stated.
And I think that really stems from a history of persecution.
Yes.
Nobody.
Yeah, I would also point out, and a number of the synagogues near here are working on the issue, that Jewish and African heritage are not separate things for everyone. There are Jews of African heritage as well.
Yes.
Correct.
Okay, and Jen has some comments about remembering that where we are all sitting this evening is land that was once the home of indigenous people. Very few of them who consented to not having that land anymore. And Tom and Pat pointed out that many schools and areas have already made the change to Indigenous Peoples Day. My memory is New York has not done that yet,
I don't think
although
so.
some communities within it have.
Mhm.
Okay. Lots and lots of thanks. I hope the presenters are looking here. I'm thinking I'm missing something. Olivia talks about the important thing about schools teaching less history and more STEM, and how that may be very dangerous.
Well, not only that, but we have a system where states can decide what goes into their textbooks. And we've seen that, you know, there is simply, I mean, there's simply falsehoods being perpetuated and taught to children as history in different states. So that's a system that really needs to be looked at.
And the reality that many of our textbooks come out of the state of Texas.
Mhm.
Yes.
That is the leading state
of this
for writing and publishing textbooks. And they are the last people who should be doing it.
As a scientist, I would say that STEM is very important, and but it should, of course, it should not be taught at the exclusion of other things. I cannot imagine that this would be. Well, I suppose it does happen that you would have to choose between science and learning history. That's very bad.
I think who writes the history is what's really important.
Yes.
And I notice in our list of participants, we have now joined us is Dr. Manaz Afridi, who is one of our local experts on the Holocaust. Dr. Afridi, would you like to say anything?
Alexa, shut down.
Hi, can everyone see me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm sorry. It's Ramadan, so we just broke fast and I just said my prayers. I told Richard, so I'm really sorry, but I really love the idea of this program. And I guess for me, I also taught seminar until like 10 to 7, and we were talking about colonization in the Muslim world. And I began with actually George Floyd and talked about decolonization and what that means. And we talked a lot about how I was a little weary how Native Americans have disappeared from the social media or stories. And I hope we can do something about that, since you were just talking about that, because, you know, we can't just, we need to do this in a way where we can confront our history in a way that is intelligent, smart, but also very sensitive to other people that are here and where we are in terms of their land. So that's a thought I had. I wasn't there for the presentation, so I really apologize. But you know, I'm a great supporter from for everybody here, and I think this is amazing. And maybe we could bring something like this to Manhattan College in the fall or the spring. That would be great.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And there will be a recording of this that you can get to.
Oh,
It'll
great.
be up within the week. I will also say in the chat, which I hope you can all find, there is information once more about the book group that is co-sponsoring tonight's presentation, and what our next book is and when we meet. And so you can find that. And also, Rick, do you want to say something about the Selma trip?
Sure. So, you know, thank you, by the way, to the presenters. I've been excited about bringing this conversation to our neighborhood for a year and a half or so when I first heard them in Irvington. And thank you to Joan for hosting. And but part of this idea of bringing this group tonight is that just as they bore witness by going to Montgomery, I'd like to be a catalyst, and I'd like with others in our community to take a trip to Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham, and sometime post-COVID, possibly next year, early or late next year. So to do this, I need to get some names of people. So Joan, should I just give my email address, or what do you think?
Sure, if you're willing to do that.
Yeah, I think we're all friends.
If you'd put it in chat, then it's not in the recording and you have a little more privacy.
Well, I put it in the chat, but many of you know me, but I would love to plan this trip together with others, you know, so we can find good dates. And there is a fellow, Billy Edgar, who hosts these trips, and they're well organized. It would probably be a 3-day trip, Sunday through Tuesday. And I think it would be a way for us to move forward in building our community here, and also in reaching out to be witnesses and to ask the questions that we all would like to be able to ask of people who are in those places. So please, if you're interested, I'd really be excited to work towards that with you. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions for our panelists? And again, I really urge you panelists to look over some of the wonderful kudos that you have expressed there. Okay, so do any of you on the panel want to add any last words?
No, just thank you for coming tonight and sharing your thoughts. With each presentation, we spread the message that we're all committed to.
I might also say that we're open for suggestions, right?
Yes.
If anybody thinks that there are things that should be included or discussed in these kinds of presentations, we would love to hear from you.
I see Bill Beckman is representing my congregation. That's hello, and thank you all for coming. I think it's for us, it's very stimulating to have this kind of discussion, and of course, we want to influence as many people as possible. Thanks.
Dr. Afridi is wanting to make a suggestion, but you can't unmute.
I think I'm unmuted now. Thanks, John. I just wanted to say, Rick, I mean, this trip is an amazing idea. I just will forward you some information on grants for such a trip that I just found recently. I think there's a lot of people that probably won't be able to afford something like that, whether we're talking about Riverdale or the Bronx. I think we have to keep that in mind and take people, you know, and maybe provide some scholarships for people to go and do this, because I think a lot of people want to go, but they can't afford it. And I've done that for trips to, you know, Berlin and Poland, Auschwitz, when I took Jewish and Muslim women there. And my center provided, you know, 2 scholarships for younger Muslim women who couldn't afford it. So I think it's so important for us to keep that socioeconomic reality in our mind when we plan these things, in terms of who can go. And I will forward that to you, Rick, tomorrow.
That would be incredible. Thank you.
Great.
I
Thank you
agree.
so much.
Yeah, that would be, I really agree. I hope that part of our planning group will be able to write such a grant or to
Oops.
an opportunity like this if they're willing, if they want to go. So I agree entirely. Also, there are some really wonderful places to visit in New York. The up in Westchester, there are some exhibits, and as well as you know, the Kingsbridge Historical Society has a lot of interesting conversations about what's going on in Van Cortlandt Park. And then the African-American burial ground in Manhattan, for folks that haven't been there, is a watershed of information and ideas. So I'm really interested in joining people in local visits as well that are more accessible and more affordable. And definitely, if we can find a group that is interested in planning this, we can put our heads together and figure out how to make this kind of a trip available to everybody who's interested.
Okay, so I have set it so any of you can unmute yourself if you would like, and we can give a literal round of applause to our participants.
Thank you. Terrific.
Bravo, well done.
Just
Thank you.
terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Joan.